Okay, so I'm just going to cover these pages pretty quickly in here. Hopefully you get a chance to read them, but this is chapter 1, and I'm just going to walk through some of these slides. So the first one, of course, you know the difference now between quantitative methods and qualitative methods. You had qualitative with Dr. Christopher, and we're going to talk a little bit about quantitative analysis more so than quantitative methods. All right, so we are going to use numbers, we're going to use data, and we're going to interpret that data. And some of you, that may scare you, but I promise you that as you work through this class, it's not going to be as scary as you think. So the research process, which you've heard over and over again, you've got your initial observation, so you have a question. So whatever your research question is, some of that we talked a little bit about last fall. You want to try to link that to a theory. So remember, a theory is something that's already established, all right? And then you, based on that theory, you generate hypotheses. So if you have a theory, and I'm going to make this up, okay, but if you have a theory of leadership and different personalities, so theoretically other people have shown that if a person has a servant heart, then they are more likely to be a transformative leader. And so you read the literature enough and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to generate a hypothesis that those people who are in higher ed who have a servant's heart tend to be more transformative than those who are not. All right, so then you have your hypothesis, and we'll do a little bit of hypothesis statements. We'll generate predictions, you will collect data ultimately, and you will measure those variables. It's going to be really, really important, again, what variable what are you measuring, and how are you going to measure that? I used an example, if you're measuring attitude, okay, how are you going to measure attitude? If you're measuring well-being, how are you going to measure well-being? Are you just going to ask them and say, how well do you feel? Or are you going to have a scale of 1 to 5? So make sure when you select the variables that you know exactly what it is you're measuring. And the other important thing that I've seen over and over again is, how do those variables, if they're quantitative, what happens to that? Do you sum all of the variables? Do you sum numbers 1 through 5 and subtract numbers 6 through 10? All right, so make sure as you go through this process, how do you actually use that data? And then ultimately you analyze that data and you make interpretations about that data. Okay, so your initial observation is you're going to find something you need to explain. Hopefully you guys are kind of on track to that. We'll talk a little bit in our first weekend and see where you guys are. And ultimately you're going to collect your data and you're going to define your variables. We're going to do a little bit of more of that this semester, is defining your variables, defining your terms, very much thinking about how you're going to measure it. And then I will give you some data sets as we progress through the semester. So again, that's your conceptual domain, all right? So your conceptual beginning into your observable domain. Conceptual, again, I am thinking through what it is I'm going to do, how it is I'm going to do it, and what's the best process to do it. And then ultimately you have your observable domain on the bottom, and your observable domain is when you're starting to collect data, which we'll go into a little bit more detail. So here's your theories and hypotheses, and then you've also got falsification. So again, your theory is something that's been established, and you generate hypotheses from these theories, and then ultimately you test your hypothesis. So I'll talk a little bit more in class perhaps, but a hypothesis is assumed, a null hypothesis is assumed to be correct until your data tells you otherwise, and we will generate some hypothesis statements based on that data. And your falsification, the act of disproving a theory or a hypothesis.